Okay, welcome back to the Honors Biotopics Biology of the Closed Ecological System. We're looking at biotic factors within that system. We talked last time about producers, and we said that producers are also known as autotrophs. The word auto meaning self, and troph meaning food. And we said that the things that have to consume others are called consumers, or hetero meaning other, and troph meaning food. So those are things that have to eat other things in order to get their energy and nutrients. We talked that there are different examples in the pond water, and that some things are known as primary consumers or herbivores. That would be things like Daphnia here, shown in the picture. It would also be things like deer in a terrestrial ecosystem. And then we talked about that carnivores are things that have to eat other organisms. So secondary consumers like the dragonfly nymph here. Other examples on land would be spiders and lions and tigers. And then we said some things are omnivores, where they eat both primary and secondary consumers. That means they eat both plant and animal material. We said one example in the CESs would be planaria, which are these guys down here. On land, we would say things like raccoons, rats, mice, people would be examples of omnivores. Now, we said that these three next pieces are all used interchangeably many times. There's decomposers, which usually we talk about things that get their energy at molecular level. Detritivores, they ingest smaller pieces, and then scavengers, which ingest larger pieces. And as you look at your CES, the reason we put substrate into the CES is to provide a habitat for the decomposers and the detritivores in order to live. The scavengers would be larger things like planaria or flatworms, shown down here. And that black band across the bottom through the substrate there would be an example of where the decomposers are, which are mostly bacteria and fungi, and they do 90% of the big work, the actual moving of molecular parts of the ecosystem, like carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids, and doing the work of the energy transfer there. This shows a food web starting here with plant plankton. Notice there's no arrows going towards the plant plankton, and that plankton would then feed tadpoles, which might feed a great diving beetle or a dragonfly larva, depending on size, of course. Daphnia would eat that, and then they might get eaten by other things. So the arrows show direction of energy transfer in here. So jot that down in your notes, that the arrows show direction of energy transfer. Now, what changes in your CES is known as biomass. Biomass is what changes when you add that light source and you feed the plants, which then feed the animals that are in there. It all starts with producers as the start. And what we're talking about here, however, is just the dry weight of the organisms. And if this was an ecosystem, or it was a pond ecosystem, the first thing would happen would be the organisms would be dried out, and then they would be weighed in to determine the amount of mass in them, is how they would determine this. So the amount of water they have doesn't have a big impact on the biomass change. And as we look at an ecosystem, we talk about some things that are upright pyramids, which is like this top pyramid here, where the top is more narrow and has less than the bottom or the base. And there's other things that are inverted pyramids, which means that the top parts have more than the base. We'll talk about why that is, and we're going to talk about three different pyramids: pyramid of biomass, a pyramid of numbers, and a pyramid of energy. And then we'll talk about whether or not they can be upright, or whether or not upright or not upright, or inverted, or whether they are always upright. So the first one is on the left-hand side here. And that's a pyramid of numbers. So if you notice, this one here would be for a land ecosystem. Excuse my writing with the pen there. So all of these ones across here are land ecosystems. Okay, so if you notice, for instance, pyramid of numbers, you would expect there to be more grass than there would be rabbits in an ecosystem. If you're talking about a square meter of land or a square kilometer or an acre of land, the number of grass species and the number of grass plants in an area would be greater than the number of rabbits and then greater than the number of foxes. However, sometimes these down here are aquatic ecosystems. I'm just going to put an A for aquatic. And so, for instance, in aquatic ecosystems, you can actually have more zooplankton, which are animals that eat plankton. Plankton just referring to animals that cannot swim against the current. There could be more zooplankton than actually plants in that ecosystem because the zooplankton are larger, are usually algae, and they can reproduce so quickly that there can actually be greater numbers of animals than there are plants to feed those animals. But if you look as the pyramid goes up, it looks once again like a pyramid. But if you notice this part here, we'd consider the bottom part of this pyramid to be inverted. So that means that this pyramid at times can be inverted. And if you think about it, if we change this to a land thing where we have trees, we might have only one tree feeding lots of herbivores, which I'm drawing up here and here, and then that could feed a smaller number of carnivores in there or secondary consumers. So the tree, you might just have one tree feeding those. So pyramids of numbers, the big thing to remember is it can be inverted. Next one is biomass, similar thing. We would expect if we weighed all of the grass in an acre of land, it would be greater, shown by the wider bar, than would be the biomass of rabbits and then the biomass of a predator. But once again, in aquatic ecosystem, because the algae is able to grow so quickly, often the energy is actually being stored in the ocean as essentially sunlight, which means you can have a greater biomass or dry weight of zooplankton. Zooplankton are small animals that eat phytoplankton or algae. And these guys here, this part here would be, oops, sorry, I lost that one. So this part here would be an inverted pyramid. Okay, so notice that we have the base is less wide as the next level up. And then of course as you get up larger and larger, it gets to be a pyramid with a wider base again. All right, so biomass can be inverted in aquatic ecosystems as well. And we said that numbers-wise, in terrestrial ecosystems, we can invert it. So just to think about inverted or upright, I'm going to put those two letters in there. And same thing, pyramid of biomass, inverted or upright. Now, notice the pyramid of energy. No matter what, you cannot invert the pyramid of energy. We'll talk about why in a second here, but notice the base width in both the terrestrial ecosystem or the aquatic ecosystem are both wider. So there's no way to invert a pyramid of energy this way because it violates some basic laws of thermodynamics we'll talk about next. So pyramid of energy is always upright. It actually shows the energy change between different levels and is due to the laws of thermodynamics. And the more common name we talk about here is calories or kilocalories. So you might think, Big Mac at McDonald's is 500 calories, but the other way of putting that information out is called a joule, which is just as a unit of energy. Now, two laws of thermodynamics to talk about. The first law says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And the thing to remember here is that when you move energy around, you're just changing its form. So when you plug in your cell phone to the wall, you're just taking the energy or the electrons energy from the wall, transferring it into the battery of your phone, and then that battery of your phone into the actual apps that run your phone. But your phone continually needs to be recharged in order to work properly. Same thing here. All ecosystems need to get energy in, specifically normally from the sun, if we're talking about things that are based on the sun's energy. The kind of bottom line here to think about with the first law of thermodynamics is you cannot win. That means you can't get your cell phone to recharge without plugging it into the wall, or your CES is not going to run very well without any input of solar energy into it, because we're going to seal it off. And the second law of thermodynamics says that in any time you transfer energy, some of that energy is lost as heat. In other words, you always lose. So if you kind of plug your cell phone into the wall and then you feel that charger and then feel your phone in about 15 minutes, you'll feel they're both warm. Or a good example is drive your car around for a while, the engine gets hot, right? You're transferring energy between either the wall to your cell phone battery and then to your phone, or from gasoline to the running of your car, and both of those cause a loss of energy in them, and that energy is lost as heat. So what that means is, what that gives us in biology is the 10% rule, which is also known as the 10% law. The actual numbers, by the way, are down here, and this group right here. In some cases, the numbers are 2%, and in other cases, they're 20%. But in general, we just kind of generalize this as 10% of the biomass. So if you look, if the amount of energy in this level of producers here is 10,000 joules, then notice the next level up there is only 10% of that. In other words, most of the energy is lost, or in other words, 90% of the energy is lost in that transfer. And this is really just a transfer of biomass. So that means, for instance, in your ecosystem, if you were going to have in there Daphnia, which would be equivalent to grasshoppers here that are eating the algae, that the algae, in order to sustain those guys, they would have to outnumber them 10 to 1 essentially in order to provide enough nutrients and keep going and not be eaten up by them. So it's important to recognize the energy transfer. The higher up the food chain, the less energy there is available to the next one. This is based on energy that ends up going into that next level of energy. Okay, so only 10% of this biomass will be found in the next energy level, and only 10% of that will be found in the next energy level. Okay, here's a bigger picture of it. And the reason this number transfers down here is because depending on the plants, but aquatic and land plants are only about 0.01 or 0.001% efficient at transferring light energy into actual biomass. So that's what you're seeing here. And then as you jump up, you go from 10,000, you take 10,000 and you multiply by 0.1, which gets you to 1,000. All right, so each time you jump up, 90% of the energy is lost, and only 10% actually becomes part of the body or biomass. Remember, we said that biomass is the dry weight. You take the thing, you kill it, you dry it out, get all the water out, and then you measure or weigh how much stuff is in there. And so what you find is that you lose 90% of the energy. Where's that lost energy? It's a couple of different places. It's energy transfer. We said that when you plug your cell phone into the wall, you're losing energy just to the heat. In this case, we're talking about energy transfer from making molecules that you digest into molecules of the body of the organism. There's always indigestible materials or waste products, right? We call that like fiber generally, or things that you're going to be part of, the waste materials. The growth of the organism, that takes some of the energy. The repair, right, that even going and attacking and killing something will require some damage or could cause some damage. So you have to repair those things, plus attacks from infections, bacteria, fungi, things like that. Homeostasis, that's just maintaining the basic body systems, which often involves things like growth and repair. And then, of course, if you're a predator, the energy of hunting, killing, and eating also goes in there. And even if you're an herbivore, that is a Daphnia or a caterpillar, you still have to go and find that plant. You have to chew it up, and then you have to digest it. So you're going to lose some of your energy that way. So the basic take-home message is that it's easier to eat at lower trophic levels. The lower you eat on the trophic level, the easier it is. And that top predators, notice the top predators here, all of them, if you kind of think about them in your head, all of them are more mobile, right? Sharks will swim thousands upon thousands of miles throughout the ocean. Mountain lions cover large areas. Orcas will cover large areas. Wolves, right, have their territory. Polar bears. So these guys have to move around a lot. And the reason they have to do that is because they are eating up here at this level, the 10 joule level on this image here. So if you're eating up here, you're not going to get much energy. If you also notice, by the way, they're also large. So that means not only do they have fewer calories coming to them, but that it means that they require a large number of calories to feed their large body size. So that means they have to cover a greater amount of land in order to be able to feed themselves and deal with the 10% rule loss. So the kind of idea here for you is to think, are you better off eating hamburgers or soy burgers? And I'm not defending a vegetarian or carnivorous diet here. I'm just saying energy-wise, what's easier, right? So the average person needs about 2,800 kilocalories per day, and that is average. If you're larger and athletic, then you probably need 4,000. If you're smaller and you don't do as much, you might only need 2,000. But that is the 2,800 number here that's shown is the number that strikes a square meter in a year. The amount of energy that strikes from sunlight a square meter in a year. So that means if you could photosynthesize, then you would need 1 meter for every day of the year. That's 365 square meters, right? Because that would feed you for the entire year. If you ate veggies only, that's 3,650 years, right? Looking at the 10% rule. If you eat herbivores, that's the deer and cow diet. It's 36,500. And if you decide to eat the lion and tiger diet, then you jump up in your amount of meters you need to feed yourself. Or to look at it a different way, if you wanted to feed everybody in Pennsylvania on hamburgers, no buns, no ketchup, no cheese, no pickles, just burgers, and everybody's going to get their 2,800 kilocalories of energy, you would need the land shown in this circle here. It's about 250,000 square miles of land, essentially Maine down to Georgia, the whole East Coast, to be able to feed the cows on that, right? Because you're dealing with the 10% rule, which means you go from grass to cows to people. That's 10%. It's 90% losses twice. But if you decided, well, rather than use all that land to feed people on the cow diet, if you wanted to feed everybody on soy burgers, you could do it on an area shown down below here, half the size of Pennsylvania, by growing soy in just that area. You could then feed everybody. Once again, soy burgers, no buns, no ketchup, no pickles, just straight up burgers. So the thing to think about with biomass is how does it get created? Now, aquatic plants are about 1% efficient. Land plants about 2 to 3%. The difference there, by the way, is that the aquatic plants have to get that light filtered through the water. So it kind of makes it tougher for them to convert the light energy into biomass. But that's our start. Then what you do is that amount of energy they capture, not the actual biomass, but the capture of energy, is known as gross primary productivity. And we're going to simplify that, by the way, as GPP, shown here. Okay, that's the amount of carbon dioxide plus light that they use to fix the amount of to fix carbon dioxide, or to grab carbon dioxide in an ecosystem. Okay, so CO2 plus light. Now, what happens is the plants have to use energy, right? They're using energy for respiration, for growth, for development, for defense, all these different parts. So we're going to take that away from whatever they grab minus what they use, which is going to be RPP. So what you see down here is you have gross primary productivity minus the amount of energy they use to run their own bodies. And what you get from a result is net, right? Net is kind of like net income. If you, for instance, have a job and you made $100 in a week, you'll notice your paycheck is not $100. It might be $70. And that means you had to pay taxes and you had to pay Social Security and you had to pay all these other little things. That's the same kind of idea here, is that plants capture an amount of energy but they don't get to keep it all. They have to use some to run their bodies. And so what we get is the net primary productivity, which is NPP, or you could also think of that as biomass. So how much new plant material is created? It's how much energy they capture. That's gross primary productivity minus how much they use, right? Everything else that's not used up minus what they capture becomes actual biomass, or becomes actual green material in your bottle that is growing. So the new biomass you see in your bottle is that net primary productivity minus, of course, any herbivores or bacteria action that reduce that or eat that. So what we're looking for is biomass growth that feeds primary producer growth, that feeds secondary or primary consumer growth, and then feeds secondary consumer growth. So one thing to think about is how might your choices of whether you add something like Spirogyra, which is also known as filamentous algae, it looks like the hair stuff that's back in the containers back there, how might that affect your ecosystem versus something like Naiad here? Naiad is another plant that's back there, but the one thing you notice about the Naiad is it's kind of spiky, right? These two plants produce and defend themselves in different ways. For instance, algae has no chemical or physical defenses. It is basically going through the ecosystem by sheer numbers. It is trying to outproduce things by its sheer production of new cells. So you think of its way of surviving, or its niche in the ecosystem, is it produces lots of new cells very quickly. Okay, so that's its way of surviving the ecosystem. So there are constantly bacteria, Daphnia, and a whole host of other herbivores in there eating this. And so rather than invest money or energy in defense, what it does is just grows rapidly. New cells produced all the time in it. Now, if you notice Naiad here, Naiad has these spiky things on its outer thing. That is to deter herbivores. Right? And that spikiness, however, is a physical defense. So Naiad is investing some of its energy rather than in growth, which is kind of the goal of cells. It's investing some of that energy in defense against herbivores. So when you put in each one of these, or if you put one or the other in, how would each one be able to help or hinder your ecosystem in terms of how it operates? And you'd want to think about that as the pyramid of energy for each option, which we'll look at down the road. Okay, that's the end of this section of notes. Hopefully you filled out your notes. We will continue with this with the biotic interactions down the road.